Hi, I'm the woman my in-laws tried to erase. They shoved a postnup across the table, told me to sign or get out with nothing, and my husband, he smirked, called me a trophy wife, and paraded his mistress like I was already gone. They thought I was powerless, until the judge read my net worth, nearly $27 million. That's when the room went silent, and their faces went cold. Before we dive in, tell me, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments, because this is the story of how I made them watch me win. The text came mid-afternoon. Family celebration dinner tonight. 7 p.m. Dress nice. No occasion, no context. That was how my in-laws liked it. Summon first, explain later. I stared at the message long enough for my coffee to go cold, then changed into a simple black dress and low heels. If they wanted a show, they wouldn't get it from me. The restaurant sat high above downtown Dallas, all glass and white tablecloths, and a view designed to make you feel small. My husband, Brandon, was already at the table with his parents. He didn't kiss my cheek or even stand. He just lifted his chin like a manager calling in an employee. His mother, Loretta, patted the chair beside her, all sugar on the surface. "You made it, dear. Traffic wasn't too much?" "It was fine," I said, sliding in. The air felt chilled, not from the AC but from them. His father, Charles, wore the kind of smile that never touched his eyes. I noticed an extra place setting. No name card. Interesting. A server poured wine. Another set down a teapot because I'd asked for tea. Brandon kept checking his watch, not his phone, as if he didn't want me to see whatever he was waiting on. Loretta's posture was so straight it could cut glass. Something had been rehearsed. "Before we order," Charles said, easing a manila envelope from beneath his menu, "let's take care of a small housekeeping item." He slid it toward me with 2 fingers, the way you push a bill you resent paying. I didn't touch it. "What is it?" "Standard protection," Brandon replied, mild as milk. "Nothing personal." Loretta leaned closer, perfume powdery and old money. "Sweetheart, it's best for everyone. These things are normal for families like ours." Families like ours. I lifted the flap and scanned the first page. Postnuptial agreement. Lines and lines of legalese boiling down to this. If our marriage ended, I would walk away with almost nothing. I would renounce any claim to Brandon's business interests, to anything acquired during the marriage, to anything they could name and lock behind a gate. Brandon spoke in that careful tone he used in negotiations. "This is just business. You'll sign it if you love me." My fingers didn't shake. I wouldn't give them that. "We've been married 6 years, I said evenly. "Why now?" Charles folded his hands. "Market conditions change. It's prudent." I looked up. "Prudent for whom?" Brandon chuckled, not kindly. "You've had a good run as a trophy wife, but it's time to protect the real family assets." The word landed like a slap, hot, then strangely numb. Trophy, as if I'd been a ribbon pinned to his lapel. Loretta and Charles shared a satisfied glance, the kind parents exchange when the son finally does what should be done. I took a slow breath, let the tea warm my palms. "If this is a celebration," I said, "what exactly are we celebrating?" "Clarity," Charles answered, "and preserving legacy." A server approached. Brandon lifted a hand to pause him. Then Brandon's phone lit up on the table. He caught the name, stood too quickly. "Work call. 2 minutes." He stepped away, but he didn't head for the hallway. He drifted toward the bar, where a woman in a silk blouse waved him over like they were old friends. Young, polished, camera-ready. He angled his body to shield the view, failing at both subtlety and shame. Loretta watched me watch them. Her voice was low, buttered with pity she didn't feel. "Better to accept reality than embarrass yourself." I stirred my tea. "Reality seems to be very busy tonight." "You'll sign," she said, soft as a threat. "Make it easy on everyone." That was the point, of course. Public pressure. Make the wife small in a public place so she'll choose silence to avoid a scene. I'd grown up in a townhouse that echoed in winter and learned early that silence could be armor if you wore it right. Brandon returned, smoothing his tie like nothing had happened. "So," he said brightly, "shall we sign and then order? Dad brought a pen." "I have my own," I said, taking the slim pen from my handbag. It wasn't flashy, just weighty enough to remind me it belonged to me. A small thing, but small things are where you find a foothold. Charles slid the envelope closer. "Initial here, here, and here. Full signature on the last page." I set my pen beside the papers and flipped pages slowly, as if I were reading a menu in a foreign language. I knew what this was. It wasn't about money, it was about rank. About putting me in my place while strangers poured wine and pretended they didn't hear. Brandon leaned back, casual. "Let's not drag it out. The attorney says it's boilerplate." "Boilerplate would include spousal protections," I said. "This waives almost all of them." Loretta smiled without warmth. "You won't need protections if you're committed to the marriage." "And if Brandon is?" I asked. Her smile didn't move. "We're all committed to doing what's best for the family." At the bar, the young woman laughed at something on Brandon's screen and touched his sleeve like it belonged to her. He didn't flinch. The server returned, hovering. "Are we ready to order?" "Give us a few," I said, and he vanished, grateful to escape the temperature at our table. I placed the envelope back in the center of the linen. "I'll need time to review the details. With counsel." Brandon exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man whose patience had been tested by a seatbelt. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Maybe it needs to be hard," I said. "Maybe that's the point." Charles's voice cooled another degree. "Refusing to sign will have consequences." "So will signing," I answered. "I'll think about it." Loretta tapped a perfect nail on the table. "Don't drag your feet. Delay creates mess, and we don't do mess." The woman from the bar drifted past our table on her way to the restroom. She glanced at Brandon with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already been chosen. Brandon kept his eyes on the bread plate. I lifted my tea again, felt the steam on my face, and let the quiet do its work. They wanted me flustered, loud, dramatic. They wanted witnesses to my collapse. Instead, I was a closed door. "Let's eat," I said at last. "None of us should make big decisions on an empty stomach." I stood, smoothed my dress, and handed the pen back across the table, letting it rest on the manila like a mark. "I'll be in touch." Brandon's jaw flexed. "You're overthinking this." "Or you're underestimating me," I said, my voice steady. I stepped away from the table, past the glittering view and the whispering servers, past the bar where the young woman checked her lipstick in the mirror and pretended not to see me. In the hallway, I paused long enough to text myself the name of the restaurant and the timestamp. Documentation is a habit. So is memory. Out in the valet lane, the night air felt warmer than inside. I tipped the young attendant, slid into my car, and sat with both hands on the wheel until my pulse matched the turn signal. I didn't drive home right away. I circled the block, let the skyline rearrange itself outside my window, and thought about the next move, not the loud one, the effective one. I smiled, set the pen down, and told them I'd need to review the details, but in that moment, I already knew exactly how this game would end. The next morning, I was up before the sun. The quiet in my house felt sharper than usual, like every sound from the coffee maker echoed in the still air. My mind replayed every word from last night. The smug smiles, the postnup pushed across the table, my husband's casual dismissal of me as if I were some disposable accessory. I had smiled through it then, but that was over. They were done writing the rules. I poured the coffee into my favorite black mug, the one I'd had since the early days of my business, and carried it to my home office. The leather chair creaked softly as I sat down, pulling my phone toward me. My hand hovered over the keypad for a moment before dialing the one person I knew wouldn't just listen, but would fight. Claudia Myers. She'd been my attorney for over a decade, sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous when she wanted to be. She picked up on the second ring. "Morning," she said, voice brisk. "What's wrong?" "I need you," I told her. "And I need you now." There was a pause, then the sound of papers being shuffled. "My office. 1 hour. I'll have the coffee ready." By the time I pulled into her private lot, the Dallas morning traffic had already started its usual crawl, but I barely noticed. Claudia's office was a glass and steel box that somehow managed to feel both unwelcoming and utterly safe. The receptionist waved me through without a word, and moments later I was stepping into Claudia's domain. Shelves lined with leather-bound law books, a desk so perfectly organized it almost looked staged. I sat across from her and laid out everything: the dinner, the sudden postnup, the way my husband's family had circled like vultures, certain they were in control. Claudia didn't interrupt. She just listened, tapping one manicured nail against her notepad, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Then they really don't know who they're dealing with." "Apparently not," I said, my voice steady. "Let's start with the obvious," she continued. "I need a complete picture of where you stand financially." I reached into my tote and pulled out the leather portfolio I'd been keeping for years, my own private ledger, updated monthly. I slid it across her desk. She opened it slowly, scanning each page. The valuation of my tech consulting firm, currently just over $18 million, the list of my commercial properties, my blue-chip stock portfolio, and the private art collection that, thanks to museum-level pieces, was worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharper than I'd seen in a long time. "We can turn this Postnup into their worst mistake." She outlined her plan. We wouldn't reject the Postnup outright. Instead, I'd play along, let them believe I was going to sign, and in the meantime, we'd gather proof of their motives and their financial maneuvering. If this ever went to court, the narrative would be theirs to lose. "You're saying let them think they've won," I said slowly. "And while they're celebrating," she replied, "we'll be building the case that will take everything they care about." I felt something shift inside me. Not quite relief, not quite triumph, but something close. "Fine. Let's do it." We spent another half-hour detailing next steps, discreetly monitoring my husband's financial activity, tracking the connections between his so-called business trips and the woman I already suspected was more than a colleague, and preparing for a reveal that would only happen in front of a judge. When I left Claudia's office, the day had warmed, sunlight bouncing off the hood of my car. I drove without turning on the radio, my thoughts drifting back to my early years, the cramped apartment, the long nights working 2 jobs, the dream that had felt so far away back then. I had built this life from nothing, and now, somehow, my own marriage had reduced me to someone underestimated. That ended today. By the time they realized I wasn't their pawn, it would be far too late to stop me. 2 weeks later, my husband wheeled his small black carry-on into the foyer, calling out that he'd be out of town for a few days. His voice was light, almost cheerful, and it set my teeth on edge. I leaned against the doorway to the kitchen, arms folded, watching him zip up the bag. "You're packing light," I remarked casually. "Just a short trip. Meetings and golf," he said, slipping his laptop bag over his shoulder. "Golf. At the end of February." "Sure." He wore jeans and a crisp polo shirt instead of his usual tailored suits for business travel. No tie, no garment bag, no stack of files. Just the look of a man headed somewhere warm and comfortable, and not for work. I didn't press him. Just nodded, stepping aside so he could roll the bag past me. "Safe travels," I said evenly, and he kissed the air near my cheek before walking out the door. I gave it 10 minutes, long enough for him to get clear of our street. Then I grabbed my keys, phone, and a pair of tinted sunglasses, sliding into my car without bothering to lock the house. My pulse was steady, not racing. This wasn't about jealousy. It was about information. About knowing exactly what kind of man I was married to, with proof that could end this marriage on my terms. The GPS app on my phone tracked his car, a silent blue dot moving away from the freeway toward the north side of the city. No turn toward the airport, no detour into downtown. Instead, he wound through manicured streets lined with sycamore trees and wrought iron gates. I stayed 2 cars back, far enough to be invisible. The homes here were sprawling, each sitting behind tall hedges and private drives. He slowed, turned into a wide driveway I'd never seen before, and pulled up to a modern stone and glass house that looked like it had been dropped in from a luxury magazine. I eased to the curb on the opposite side, lowering my sunglasses just enough to watch. The front door swung open before he even reached it. A woman stepped out, late 20s, tall, with the kind of effortless beauty that only comes from knowing she's admired. A silk robe floated around her as she smiled at him like she'd been waiting all morning. They embraced. Not the awkward, polite hug of acquaintances. This was familiar. Easy. Her hand lingered on his chest before she took the handle of his bag. He followed her inside without glancing back. I lifted my phone, angling it through the windshield. One wide shot, then another. Both faces visible. The sunlight caught her hair in a way that almost looked staged. I took a short video as he disappeared into the doorway, luggage in tow. I waited. 15 minutes. 30. An hour. No sign of him coming out. With my free hand, I pulled up the county's property records. The address was leased under a shell company, one that, when I dug 2 layers deeper, was tied directly to a holding subsidiary of my husband's family's business. The pieces slid into place with a cold kind of clarity. This wasn't just infidelity. It was organized, funded, and protected by the very people who had shoved that Postnup in front of me. Leaning back in the seat, I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, all I saw was my own reflection. Sunglasses, calm expression, no tear-streaked face, no shaking hands. I realized I didn't look hurt. I looked focused, calculating. They thought this would crush me. Instead, it was making me untouchable. I lowered the phone, started the car, and pulled away without hurry. Evidence secured. Address logged. Next steps already forming in my mind. If they wanted war, I'd make sure it was fought on my battlefield. Continuing the content of the previous chapter. The next morning, I walked into the family company unannounced, and every conversation stopped. The lobby had that polished, too quiet air you only get in places where everyone knows something's wrong, but no one dares say it out loud. The receptionist, a woman I'd known for years, looked up from her desk with wide eyes. Her hand froze mid-type, then she quickly picked up the phone, speaking in a low voice while glancing at me. I didn't bother waiting for her to finish. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I crossed the lobby. The security guard at the turnstile, usually all smiles, stood stiffly and swiped me through without a word. By the time the elevator carried me to the executive floor, the hum of conversation had already faded. Stepping out, I could feel the shift in the air, that subtle vacuum that happens when people stop talking mid-sentence. I pushed open the frosted glass door to the boardroom. My husband, father-in-law, and sister-in-law were seated at the long walnut table, papers spread before them. They were mid-discussion, leaning toward each other, until they saw me. Their smiles vanished instantly. "Good morning," I said lightly, as if this was just a casual drop-in. "I thought I'd stop by." No one replied. My husband's jaw tightened. My sister-in-law straightened in her chair, her manicured nails tapping against a coffee cup. My father-in-law sat back slowly, measuring me with those calculating eyes that had made him a feared negotiator for decades. I walked to the head of the table and set a thin folder down in front of me. I came across something I thought the board might want to see. My husband's gaze flicked to the folder, then back to my face. And what would that be? His voice was flat, trying too hard to sound unbothered. Without answering, I slid the folder across the table until it stopped in front of my father-in-law. The sound of it moving over the wood was louder than it should have been. Inside was the beginning of what I had, just a taste: photographs, time-stamped location data, and a short list of financial transactions linking a shell company to the corporate accounts. I kept the most damning evidence at home. For now, this was enough to shift the ground under their feet. I thought the board should be aware of irregular expenditures, I said evenly. My sister-in-law's eyes darted toward her brother. He shifted in his seat, leaning away from the folder as though it might bite. My father-in-law didn't open it right away. What exactly are you implying? I let the question hang in the air for a beat before smiling faintly. Nothing. Yet? But transparency is important in family business, isn't it? The words landed harder than they sounded. I could see the flicker of recognition in my father-in-law's eyes, the understanding that I wasn't bluffing. I reached for my bag, slinging it over my shoulder in one smooth motion. "I'll let you get back to your meeting," I said, turning toward the door without waiting for a reply. The tension was almost tangible, like the air had thickened. As I stepped into the hallway, I caught the low murmur of voices starting up again, faster now, tighter. By the time the elevator doors closed, the whispers had already begun to ripple down the corridor. They'd spend the rest of the day wondering just how much I knew, continuing the content of the previous chapter. That evening, my sister-in-law showed up at my door, with an envelope she wasn't supposed to give me. It was close to 8 when I heard the knock. I'd just poured myself a cup of tea, trying to shake off the boardroom tension that still clung to me like smoke. When I opened the door, she was standing there in a fitted coat, hair slightly windblown, eyes darting down the hallway. "Can I come in?" she asked quickly, stepping inside before I even answered. The urgency in her tone wasn't something I'd heard from her before. She was usually composed to the point of arrogance. She kept her coat on, glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone to be watching from the street. "No one saw me come here," she muttered, almost to herself. Then she looked at me, her voice low. "I don't have much time." From her bag, she pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed, the flap taped over twice, and stamped with a red confidential mark. She held it out like it was something hot, something she didn't want to keep in her hands a second longer. "You should see this before it disappears," she said, avoiding my eyes. "And before they figure out I made a copy." I didn't take it right away. "What is it?" "Proof," she said simply. "The kind you've been looking for. Or maybe, the kind you didn't know you needed." Her gaze flickered. Not guilt exactly, but something close. "I don't trust them anymore. Not my brother, not my father. Not after what I've seen." I finally took the envelope, the weight of it heavier than it looked. We moved to the dining table, and I sat down with it in front of me. She stayed standing, arms crossed, as though sitting would make her too comfortable. I broke the seal carefully. Inside was a stack of photocopies, financial statements from the company's accounts, contracts tied to a shell corporation I'd never heard of, and the first pages of what looked like a private investigator's report. The details were meticulous: account numbers, dates, signatures, and then the pattern became clear. Company funds redirected into personal expenses, not just vacations or jewelry, payments for an apartment lease downtown, luxury cars, and consulting fees that all tied back to the same woman, the Mistress. The dates lined up perfectly with the weeks they cornered me into signing the Postnup, those same weeks when I'd been made to feel like a burden instead of a partner. I looked up at her. "Why are you giving me this?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Because I'm done being invisible. I've been running the parts of the business that actually make money, and they still treat me like I'm lucky to sit at the table. If this gives me some leverage later, so be it." She leaned in slightly. But I don't want my name anywhere near it. You understand? I nodded slowly. She had her own reasons, self-serving ones, but that didn't make the papers in my hands any less valuable. Thank you, I said quietly, though my tone was neutral. I wasn't about to show her just how significant this was. Inside, my mind was already moving, cataloging what I had, thinking of how it could be used and when. The right moment could make this more than just a set of accusations. It could be the shift that toppled the entire facade. She headed toward the door without taking off her coat. Just before she stepped out, she turned back to me. "Careful who you trust," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "They're more desperate than you think." The door clicked shut behind her, and the townhouse felt impossibly quiet. I set the envelope down on the table and stared at it for a long moment. I had the proof. Now I just needed the perfect stage to use it. Continuing the content of the previous chapter. That stage came sooner than I expected. At the company's annual gala, under the chandeliered ceiling they thought I'd never stand beneath again. 2 weeks later, I stepped out of the car and into the warm glow spilling from the entrance of the Grand Wyndham Hotel. My driver opened the door, and I smoothed the skirt of my midnight blue gown before taking the marble steps. The dress was sleek, understated, but cut to fit me like it had been made for this night. As I crossed the threshold, the soft hum of music and the low murmur of conversation swelled around me. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Heads turned, some out of curiosity, others with that thinly veiled disapproval people use when they think you should have stayed hidden. I caught fragments. She came. After what happened, drifting through the air like perfume. The ballroom was dressed to impress. Gold tablecloths, crystal centerpieces catching the light from chandeliers the size of small cars. At the far end of the room, I spotted him. My husband standing tall with that easy charm he wore like a suit. On his arm was the same woman whose name had appeared again and again in the papers I'd pulled from that envelope. They were laughing, heads bent together, as if they were the only two people in the room who mattered. I didn't look away first. Instead, I turned toward the cluster of shareholders near the champagne bar. One by one, I greeted them with the kind of warmth and steadiness that made them pause mid-sip. "It's good to see you," I told one, taking his hand firmly. "I've been meaning to follow up about the distribution numbers. Fascinating trend this quarter." No mention of the scandal, no hint of bitterness. Just business, clean and simple, with a smile that didn't waver. Every move I made was deliberate. I kept my clutch close. Inside, the proof that could undo half the room if used right. But tonight wasn't about throwing punches. It was about making sure they remembered I still belonged here. Halfway through a conversation with the CFO, I saw her coming. The Mistress. A crystal flute in her hand, her lipstick fresh, her eyes fixed on me with an expression that tried too hard to be friendly. "Well," she began, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "you're brave showing your face here. Guess old habits die hard." The hum of the room dimmed a notch. A few heads turned, eager for the drama they thought might unfold. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a sharp retort. I just tilted my head, letting her voice hang in the air like a bad aftertaste. She took another sip, swaying slightly, the telltale signs of too much champagne starting to show. "Of course," she went on, "I suppose you can come. After all, those transfers paid for Paris." She laughed lightly, as if it were a joke, but the ripple it sent through the onlookers was anything but amused. I didn't need to look around to know some of the board members had caught it. Transfers? Paris? None of that had been made public. My eyes went to my husband. His smile faltered, the smallest crack, but enough for me to see the shift. I let the moment stretch. Then I turned, meeting the eyes of the nearest group. "Some things deserve a proper audience," I said evenly, my voice carrying just enough to be heard over the music. "We'll speak soon." And with that, I moved toward the exit. No rushing, no fluster, just the sound of my heels tapping across the polished floor, leaving behind a pocket of silence thick enough to slice. Out in the corridor, away from the chandelier light, I allowed myself the smallest breath of satisfaction. If she could spill that much by accident, imagine what I could make them reveal on purpose. Continuing the content of the previous chapter, the opportunity came faster than I'd planned, in the form of a summons from the boardroom itself. 3 days after the gala, my phone lit up with an official message from the company's corporate secretary. Board meeting. Attendance required. Agenda. Operational concerns. It didn't take a genius to see whose fingerprints were all over that invitation. That morning, I took my time getting ready. Crisp charcoal suit, pearl studs, hair pulled back in a clean twist. Nothing flashy, but impossible to mistake for anything less than authority. On the drive to headquarters, I let my thoughts settle into order. There would be no raised voice from me, no scramble to defend myself. This wasn't their trial of me. It was my stage. When I walked into the 11th floor boardroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The long, polished table stretched toward the far window, where my husband sat at the head like a man rehearsing his victory. To his right, his father leaned back, chin lifted in that familiar way he used when preparing to deliver a lecture. His mother sat stiffly beside him, clutching her handbag like a gavel. I slid into the empty chair nearest the center, setting my briefcase down without looking away from them. The board members, a half circle of seasoned faces, exchanged the polite nods they were trained to give, but the curiosity in their eyes betrayed them. My father-in-law struck first. Your appearance at the gala disrupted the focus of the evening. We value discretion here, and frankly, your conduct has raised questions about your commitment to this company's reputation. Before I could respond, my husband leaned forward, sliding a crisp sheet of paper toward me. Let's not waste anyone's time, he said smoothly. We have an agreement, signed, notarized. You know your role, and your limits. It was the Postnup, the same document they'd cornered me into signing months ago, back when they thought humiliation was the easiest way to keep me small. I didn't touch it. Instead, I slowly rotated the paper so the board could see it right side up. Yes, I said, tapping a finger on a section halfway down the page. This clause. Do you recall who insisted on adding it? One of the older board members frowned, adjusting his glasses to read. My husband's mouth twitched. His father shifted uncomfortably. It states, I continued, keeping my tone even, that any shares or assets in my personal name are to be treated as voting stock for the purposes of company decisions. At the time, that seemed harmless. You all assumed I'd never own enough to matter. I leaned back slightly. Unfortunately for you, my portfolio has grown considerably. A ripple of murmurs moved around the table. I opened my briefcase, pulled out a single, clean folder, and slid it toward the nearest board member. As of last quarter, my personal holdings surpass the combined stake of the immediate family, which means, in any matter requiring a majority, I let the pause stretch. I hold the deciding vote. The CFO, a man not prone to theatrics, raised an eyebrow and quietly beckoned the corporate secretary forward. They exchanged a few hushed words as they checked the filings. When the secretary nodded, the CFO's gaze darted to me with something bordering on respect. My husband's face drained of color. His father's jaw clenched, and his mother's hand went rigid on her purse. I gathered the Postnup and the folder, stacking them neatly. I appreciate the invitation, I said, standing. As for the upcoming merger, I'll let you know my position when I'm ready. No one spoke. I walked the length of the boardroom, each step steady, my heels striking the floor in quiet punctuation. At the door, I paused just long enough to look over my shoulder. Enjoy the rest of your meeting. The hallway outside felt lighter, quieter, like stepping from a storm into clear air. They thought they'd summoned me to put me in my place, Instead, I'd left them staring at a truth they couldn't spin or bury. They had no idea. The merger was already mine to command. Continuing the content of the previous chapter. And the first move was to bring an unexpected ally into the game. 2 days after the board meeting, I sent a short, direct message through a secure channel. "We need to talk. Neutral ground." It went to a man I'd never thought I'd willingly meet, a business rival my in-laws despised with a passion. His name alone could make my husband's mother spit her coffee, which was exactly why I chose him. By mid-afternoon, I was already seated in the corner of a quiet, upscale cafe, tucked between a boutique hotel and a law firm. The place smelled faintly of roasted beans and warm pastry, but my attention was on the glass door, not the menu. From where I sat, I had a perfect view of every person walking in. I didn't expect this conversation to be warm. I expected it to be cautious, maybe even tense. When he arrived, he scanned the room once before spotting me. No handshake, just a raised brow and a slow approach. "Well," he said, sliding into the chair opposite mine, "either you've lost your mind or you're finally ready to play a real game." "Maybe both," I replied, signaling for coffee for us both. I kept my voice low, steady. "I'm not here to waste time. You know the merger my in-laws are desperate to close?" He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Hard not to. They've been circling that deal like vultures." I let the corner of my mouth lift. They've been working under the assumption they control the vote. They don't. Not anymore. His eyes narrowed, assessing me like I was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Go on." Over the next few minutes, I laid it out. My current position in the company's voting structure, how the Postnup had unintentionally cemented my authority, and the growing panic in my in-laws' camp. I didn't give him every detail, but I gave him enough to know I wasn't bluffing. He tapped a finger against his cup. "So why me?" "Because," I said, leaning forward, "this merger could benefit you, if the terms change. And I'm in the position to change them. You get the expansion you've been chasing for years. I get a board that isn't run like a family dinner table where the loudest voice wins." He studied me for a long moment, then chuckled. "You know they'd call this a betrayal on my part." I shrugged. "They already think you're the enemy. Might as well make it worth your while." Silence hung between us, broken only by the sound of the espresso machine in the background. Then he exhaled, slow and measured. "All right, I'll play ball. But you should know, once this goes public, it's going to be a PR nightmare. They'll come after both of us, hard." "I'm counting on it," I said. "I'm done letting them control the narrative." We ironed out the broad strokes in less than an hour, a strategic alliance that would restructure the board and secure my leadership role while giving him the foothold he needed for his expansion. The terms weren't perfect, but they were enough to shift the balance of power. When the cafe owner, an old friend of mine, brought over our second round of coffee, I caught his eye. "Would you mind witnessing something for us?" He smiled knowingly. "Of course." Right there, with the faint hum of conversation around us, we signed a preliminary agreement. 2 signatures, 1 discreet witness. No fanfare, just the quiet beginning of a storm. I slid my copy into my bag, feeling a strange combination of relief and anticipation. This wasn't the end. It was the opening move in a much bigger fight. As I stood to leave, my ally, formerly my rival, gave me a half smile. "Careful," he said. "Once you start this, there's no turning back." I met his gaze. "That's the point." Outside, the late afternoon light cast long shadows across the sidewalk. I walked toward my car, the folder secure under my arm, knowing I'd just tipped the scales in a way my in-laws would never see coming. They thought they had me cornered. Now I had the perfect piece to checkmate them. So, continuing the content of the previous chapter, and the final move would play out in a room they thought was theirs alone. 1 week later, the lobby of the headquarters was buzzing. The marble floors reflected polished shoes and tense faces as shareholders filed into the conference hall. My in-laws arrived first, flanked by their usual entourage, wearing the smug expressions of people who believed the battle was already won. My husband walked a step ahead of his mother, leaning toward her as if they were co-conspirators about to collect their prize. I stepped inside a few minutes later, alone, dressed in a tailored navy suit. No flashy jewelry, no unnecessary flair, just enough to show I belonged at the head of the table without needing to announce it. I moved slowly through the room, greeting a few familiar shareholders, listening to the polite chatter, masking the storm I was about to unleash. When the chair called the meeting to order, I let the formalities run their course for a moment before standing. My voice was steady. Before we proceed, I'd like to propose an amendment to today's agenda. Per our corporate bylaws, I have secured majority shareholder support to introduce an emergency motion. A ripple of surprise moved across the room. My husband leaned toward his mother, whispering something sharp enough to crease her forehead. Before they could object, the man from last week, the one they loathed, rose from his seat. His voice carried easily. As of this morning, I've entered into a binding agreement with her. Our combined shares meet the threshold for an immediate vote. Chairs creaked as people shifted. A low murmur spread like static. The voting balance had just tilted, and everyone knew it. I let the silence settle before sliding a folder across the table toward the chair. Here's the judge's certified reading from our recent court session. As you can see, my personal assets are more than enough to secure independent contracts without relying on this company. I don't need to be here. I choose to be here. I saw my husband stiffen, his jaw tightening. His mother's knuckles whitened against the armrest. And one more thing, I continued, opening another document. The postnuptial agreement you were so proud of. You must have forgotten about Section 14, subparagraph C, the non-compete clause. If I am removed against my will, you owe me a penalty sum that would take a large chunk out of your holdings. Millions. Gasps broke the air. One board member nearly dropped his pen. My husband stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. I folded my hands on the table. So here's the motion. Remove current leadership positions held by family members who have conflicts of interest and appoint replacements based on performance and merit, effective immediately. The vote was swift. My rival-turned-ally's presence made the outcome inevitable. When the final tally was announced, the decision was clear. My in-laws were out. I was confirmed as chair. A faint click drew my attention. Press cameras, discreetly invited by my ally, capturing the moment. Their lenses froze the exact expressions I'd waited months to see. Disbelief, anger, and the dawning realization that the game was over. I took a breath and spoke to the room. This company was built on the idea that family means trust and respect. Those values should extend to every shareholder, every employee, and every customer we serve. We will move forward with integrity and fairness, two things we've been missing for far too long. When the meeting adjourned, I didn't linger. I gathered my documents, offered polite nods, and walked out into the crisp afternoon light. No victory speech, no gloating. Just the quiet satisfaction of a fight well fought. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A message from my ally. Told you it would work. I smiled and typed back, "We're just getting started." Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying them, it's making them watch you thrive.